The desert wind howled across the Holy Land, carrying the scent of death and burning wood. 500 weary knights stood before an army that blotted out the horizon. 26,000 of Saladin's most ferocious warriors, their banners black with vengeance. The knights had no reinforcements, no escape, and no mercy to expect. Yet they tightened their grips on their swords and looked to the crimson cross sewn on their tunics. This was not just a battle for survival. It was a stand for faith, for honor, for the world they believed God had given them. History would remember this day not for numbers, but for courage that defied reason. The year was 1177, and the kingdom of Jerusalem stood trembling on the edge of ruin. Saladin, the mighty sultan of Egypt and Syria, had united the Muslim world with fire and sword. His dream was clear: to sweep the Crusaders from the Holy Land forever. His army, vast and unstoppable, rolled like a desert storm toward the small Christian outpost of Ramla. Few dared to resist him. Even fewer could hope to survive. Amid this storm stood Baldwin IV, the leper king. Barely 16 and crippled by disease, Baldwin was no ordinary ruler. He could barely hold his sword, yet his mind was sharp as the edge of one. While his advisors begged him to flee, Baldwin looked toward the horizon and whispered, "Then let them come." He would not yield Jerusalem to the Sultan. The boy who could not feel his hands would soon make the world feel his wrath. The message went out across the Crusader states. "Ride with your king," it said, "and stand against the tide." 500 knights answered, the last remnants of faith in a dying kingdom. They rode not for gold nor glory, but for the Holy Sepulchre itself. And as the desert sun rose red as blood, they rode into history. Saladin's army stretched for miles, a river of iron and banners glinting under the sun. He rode at its head, calm and regal, certain of his triumph. Reports told him Baldwin's forces were scattered, Jerusalem undefended. His generals laughed. This would be no battle, only slaughter. Even the wind seemed to sing a victory for the Sultan of Islam. But pride blinds even the wisest conqueror. Saladin's scouts failed to notice that Baldwin had not fled north as expected. Instead, he hid his small army near Ramla, close to the coastal plains. There he waited like a lion in tall grass, silent and deadly. Every day that passed brought Saladin's forces deeper into enemy territory, farther from supplies and closer to the trap. By the time Saladin reached the plains of Montgisard, his army was tired, overconfident, and spread thin. They laughed at the idea of Christian resistance. They would soon stop laughing, for in that sun-scorched valley destiny waited with steel in hand. Baldwin knew one truth: he could not win by defense. His 500 knights were a drop in an ocean, but if he could strike Saladin when least expected, he could shatter the illusion of invincibility. He gathered his men near the castle of Ibelin, their armor gleaming in the fading sun. "This day," he said, "we fight not for life, but for God's will." The knights bowed their heads as priests blessed their swords. They knew the odds. Every man expected to die, yet no one turned away. In silence they mounted their horses, ready to charge into the heart of a force 50 times their size. The king, wrapped in white cloth to hide his disease, rode at their front. The boy who should have been dead was leading the living. As the sun sank below the hills, Baldwin's plan took form. Under cover of dusk, his knights moved swiftly across the desert. Dust rose behind them like a ghostly cloud. Ahead, the campfires of Saladin's army burned bright. unaware that death was riding straight toward them. At dawn, Saladin's men were still breaking their fast when the ground began to tremble. At first, they thought it thunder, then came the sound of steel, the cry of Deus Vult, echoing across the valley. From behind a ridge, 500 Crusader knights burst forth like avenging angels. Their lances gleamed in the sun as they slammed into Saladin's unprepared vanguard. Chaos erupted. Horses reared, tents collapsed, and the Sultan's men stumbled in panic. The narrow valley worked against them, trapping thousands in confusion. The shock of the first charge cut deep into their ranks, and the disciplined heart of Saladin's army began to unravel. Baldwin's knights rode as if possessed, cutting through lines like fire through dry grass. The Sultan himself barely escaped the first onslaught. He saw his banners fall, his elite guards cut down. Never before had Saladin's name been associated with defeat. And yet here, on the plains of Montgisard, the impossible was happening. The clash of iron drowned out the world. Crusaders' swords found flesh, and the dust turned red with blood. Baldwin's knights, though outnumbered 50-1, fought with a fury that seemed divine. Each charge broke a new line. Each fallen knight was replaced by another roaring the name of God. "Jerusalem!" they cried, and the valley answered. Saladin's commanders tried to rally their men, but confusion ruled. The campfires still burned, igniting supply carts and tents. Smoke filled the air as horses screamed and archers fled. What was once an army became a mob of terrified men. The Sultan realized too late that his tactical genius had been outmatched by a boy with faith stronger than fear. By midday, Montgisard was littered with corpses. Baldwin's sword, though heavy in his weakened hands, struck true. Each strike was a prayer, each victory a miracle. History would call it madness. The knights called it faith. For the first time in years, Saladin's banner turned away from battle. His army, broken and bleeding, fled south toward Egypt. The Sultan himself narrowly escaped capture, protected only by a handful of his bodyguards. His reputation, the invincible conqueror, lay shattered in the dust. Behind him, Baldwin's men raised their swords in victory. The young king could barely stay upright, but he refused to rest. He ordered his men to pursue until the enemy vanished beyond the desert horizon. For every mile, they passed the remains of what had been the mightiest force in the region. The leper king had turned the tide of war with fewer men than a single of Saladin's divisions. That night, the knights gathered around their king. Many wept openly. They had done the impossible. Baldwin, too weak to stand, looked toward the stars and whispered, "God was with us." His legend had just begun. The news of the victory spread like wildfire through Christendom. From Jerusalem to Rome, bells rang and prayers filled cathedrals. Pilgrims wept upon hearing how a dying boy had struck down the most feared sultan on earth. To the Muslims, it was an unthinkable humiliation. To the Christians, a miracle of divine intervention. But Baldwin knew what the world refused to see: Saladin would return. The Sultan was wounded in pride, not broken in will. The victory had bought them time, not peace. The king ordered the fortification of every border and the strengthening of every wall. Faith alone had won the battle. Preparation would win the war. Yet in those quiet nights, the young king's disease worsened. His hands shook, his skin grew pale, but his eyes still burned with defiance. The man whom death could not claim had no intention of surrendering his crown to fear. Montgisard had saved Jerusalem, but it had also cost Baldwin dearly. His illness spread, robbing him of sensation, then strength. He could no longer hold his sword, and yet he ruled with an iron will. The people called him the Leper King, but in whispers they called him God's chosen. Saladin, meanwhile, vowed vengeance. He rebuilt his army larger and more disciplined than before. His defeat had taught him humility, patience, and caution. He would not underestimate Baldwin again. The next time he came, it would be as a storm no man could stop. And yet, somewhere deep within, even Saladin respected his enemy. He called Baldwin a king of iron heart and a body of dust. History would remember both men not as enemies but as equals on opposite sides of destiny. Years passed since Montgisard, and though the banners of Jerusalem still waved proudly, their king was fading. Baldwin IV, now in his early 20s, had become a symbol more than a man. His body failed him, yet his mind burned brighter than ever. He ruled from behind veils and curtains, hiding his disfigurement from the court, but his words still commanded armies and silenced rivals. Every council meeting began with one truth: Jerusalem stood because Baldwin still breathed. But within the city walls, intrigue festered. Ambitious nobles plotted for power, whispering that the leper king's end was near. Baldwin's sister, Sibylla, and her husband Guy of Lusignan eyed the throne with hungry hearts. The Templars and Hospitallers, once united by faith, began to feud over gold and glory. Baldwin watched it all, knowing that enemies inside the walls could destroy what no army outside ever could. Beyond the Jordan, Saladin was rebuilding. His spies in Jerusalem reported every weakness, every dispute. The Sultan bided his time, sharpening both sword and strategy. He would strike again, not through fury, but through patience. He knew the day would come when Baldwin's strength failed, and the kingdom would crumble like sand between his fingers. By 1182, Saladin's banners rose once more over the horizon. His army, now disciplined and immense, advanced like a living tide across Galilee. He struck at fortresses, burned crops, and tested the Crusader resolve with every raid. But Baldwin, though weakened, rode again. Wrapped in silver armor and supported by his loyal knights, he met Saladin's force near Beaver Castle. It was a battle of endurance rather than numbers. Saladin sought to draw Baldwin into open plains, but the king refused. He fought like a shadow, striking quickly and retreating into strongholds. His tactics frustrated the Sultan, who expected the same rash courage that had shattered his army years ago. Instead, Baldwin fought with the cunning of a dying lion, slow, deliberate, and unyielding. For weeks, Saladin's men failed to capture a single fortress. Supplies ran low, and disease spread through the Muslim camp. The Sultan was forced to retreat once again. As he rode south, he gazed back at the hills and muttered, "So long as that leper lives, Jerusalem is beyond my reach." Baldwin had beaten him not with might, but with will. Baldwin's victories could not stop time. His body, ravaged by leprosy, began to fail completely. His face was covered in cloth, his hands useless, and his eyes dimmed by pain. He ruled now through scribes and generals, carried on a litter to the council chambers. The nobles whispered that a corpse ruled Jerusalem. But when he spoke, silence fell across the hall. His voice, weak yet commanding, reminded all of Montgisard. He named his nephew, Baldwin V, as co-king a child who would carry the royal line after him. Yet even that act invited betrayal. Guy of Lusignan, married to Baldwin's sister, sought to claim the throne through marriage. Baldwin saw the corruption spreading, but lacked the strength to uproot it. Still, he clung to the one truth that defined his life: Jerusalem must never fall. Outside the palace, the people prayed for their king. The leper who could not feel his hands had touched every heart. He had become a living relic of divine will, and though the disease consumed him, Baldwin's soul remained untouchable. His reign was no longer about ruling, it was about leaving behind something greater than himself. In 1183, as word reached Jerusalem of Saladin's new invasion, Baldwin demanded to be carried into battle one last time. His generals begged him to rest, but the king refused. "If I die in bed," he said, "I die as a man already gone. But if I die before my knights, I die a king." They carried him on a litter, wrapped in armor, his sword strapped to a hand that could no longer hold it. The sight of him moved the army to tears. Soldiers who had lost faith found it again at the sight of their dying king leading them from his litter. When the two forces met near the plain of Ramla, Baldwin's presence alone turned despair into fury. The Crusaders fought with renewed spirit, pushing back Saladin's advance through sheer will. The Sultan, watching from a distance, bowed his head, not in prayer, but in respect. When the smoke cleared, Saladin withdrew once again. Baldwin's army stood victorious, though their king was nearly dead. As night fell, Baldwin was carried back to Jerusalem, his body barely alive, but his eyes still shining. "Tell them," he whispered to his squire, "that Jerusalem stands." It would be his last command. Baldwin IV died in 1185 at the age of 24. His body was carried through the streets of Jerusalem, followed by knights and priests who wept openly. Bells tolled across the city, echoing through every church tower. Even the common folk knelt as the coffin passed. They were not mourning just a king, they were mourning the last symbol of unity, the last man who had held back the tide. In Cairo, when news of Baldwin's death reached Saladin, the Sultan stood silent for a long while. Then he said quietly, "There was never a braver man among the Franks. For all their wars and hatred, Saladin had recognized the greatness of his enemy." Baldwin's courage had become legend, not only among Christians, but also among Muslims. His story crossed borders, faith, and time. The boy who should have died in childhood had outlived empires in memory. His sword rested in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, his name etched in stone. And though his kingdom would soon fall to Saladin, the tale of Montgisard would live on proof that faith could defy destiny. 2 years after Baldwin's death, the fragile peace collapsed. Baldwin V died young, and Guy of Lusignan seized the throne. His arrogance and greed divided the Crusader nobility. When Saladin saw the chaos within Jerusalem, he knew the time had come. In 1187, his massive army marched north, sweeping across the Holy Land like a sandstorm. The Crusader army met him at Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee. Unlike Baldwin, Guy had no strategy, no restraint. He led his men into open plains under the blazing sun, where Saladin's forces surrounded them. Trapped and dying of thirst, the Crusaders broke. The Templars were slaughtered, their relics taken, and Guy was captured alive. The cross that once led Baldwin's charge now fell into Muslim hands. That autumn, Jerusalem surrendered. The walls that had stood for a century opened to Saladin without bloodshed. The Sultan, remembering Baldwin, spared the civilians and allowed them to leave in peace. He entered the holy city not as a butcher, but as a ruler who understood mercy. In that moment, the legend of Montgisard came full circle, the conqueror honoring the conquered. Centuries have passed, but the wind over Montgisard still whispers the same story. A boy king with a dying body and an unbreakable soul. 500 knights who chose faith over fear. A sultan whose power met humility on a single battlefield. It was not merely a clash of swords, it was the triumph of spirit over fate. Even today, historians debate how 500 men could defeat 26,000. Some say luck, others strategy. But those who stood there knew the truth. It was faith that turned steel into fire. It was the belief that dying for something eternal makes even a doomed man immortal. Montgisard was not won by numbers, but by conviction. And as the centuries fade, their story endures. For in every age there are moments when the impossible becomes real, when courage defies reason. Baldwin IV, the leper king, taught the world that victory is not born from strength, but from purpose. And on that blood-soaked plain, beneath the burning sun, he proved that even the dying can save the living. The sands of Montgisard are silent now, but beneath them lie the echoes of valor. 500 knights who faced the storm and refused to kneel. A young king who turned weakness into power and death into legend. And a sultan who learned that respect can be born even from defeat. Their story is carved not in stone, but in the human spirit, a reminder that belief can make mortals immortal. History may fade, empires may fall, but courage is eternal. And so, as the desert wind sighs over the ruins of the old battlefield, it carries one truth to those who listen. Faith is the mightiest sword of all.